Hello everyone, we are just about to get started. I'm just going to give it until about 2:03 to give everyone a chance to get on. So as usual, if you have any questions, please go ahead and leave those in the comment box and we'll get started here at about 2:03. Thank you. All right, it looks like we have our usuals on right now, but that's okay if anyone joins a little bit late. I know the AC website has been a little hit or miss lately, so hopefully everything's working well on y'all's end. So we just finished up week 4. That means that we are officially past the halfway point of this course. We're going to go ahead and start week 5. If you cannot see these folders, as usual, just make sure that you're hitting that mark reviewed button to open the next folder. So week 5 is going to cover chapters 11 and 12. Chapter 11 covers economic growth and the wealth of nations, and chapter 12 is all about growth theory. So these two chapters pair really well together. Obviously, this is kind of a bit of a jump forward in this class, but it uses a lot of the same concepts that we have in previous chapters. So I think you'll find that this week is a really comfortable and easy week. Now, just to kind of look ahead a little bit, in week 6, we will go ahead and cover chapters 13 and 14, and you'll have your next exam that's going to be over chapters 11 through 14. If you're happy with your exam and your overall grade after this 3rd exam, remember, I do drop one of our exams, so you don't have to take that 4th exam if you are satisfied with your grade after you take that 3rd exam. Now, in week 7, this is going to be the last week that we actually cover new material. So week 7 is going to be 3 chapters, chapters 16, 17, and 18. There won't be a lecture video over chapter 18, but if you do need any help on this chapter, definitely feel free to send me an email. And then week 8 is just your final exam. So really, after this week, we only have 2 more weeks of actual lecturing, so you guys are getting really close to the finish line. Just kind of hang in there. But if there's no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and move into the slideshow for today's lecture. All right, so chapter 11 is all about economic growth and the wealth of nations. Now, in my experience teaching this class, a lot of students really like this chapter. It seems to be kind of an easier chapter after all of the hard work that you've been doing this semester. And it's really relevant because it's material that a lot more students find interesting than some of the other chapters. So we'll just go ahead and jump right into it here. Now, the big questions today, we want to know, why does economic growth matter? And really, what is economic growth? Because we haven't covered a formal definition of that yet. How do resources and technology contribute to economic growth? You can probably guess on this one just with your personal knowledge and kind of life experiences, but we'll definitely answer that as well. And then we'll talk about what institutions foster economic growth. So this third question on the big question slide is typically the one that most students don't know a lot about, and we'll definitely cover all of that today. Now, I see Jessica posted and asked, for the last week when there are 3 chapters, do we need to just do the inquisitive for one? That is correct. So if the last 3 chapters are 16, 17, and 18, as long as you do one of those 3 inquisitives, so chapter 16, you will get participation grades on the last 2. Now, I definitely want you to at least look at those, even if you're not planning on taking the final exam, because there's a lot of really good material in those chapters, but you do only need to do one of those inquisitives to get that participation grade on the other 2. And just another side note that I skipped ahead a little bit on, I will have your exam grades updated and curved today, your participation for last week's participation chapter updated today, and that exam review for your next exam will be available today as well. So just give me a little bit of time to get caught up on that one. All right, so the first section of this chapter kind of talks about why wealth matters. So we've already talked about GDP. We know this is the basic kind of way that we measure the nation's income, and it's the value of all the final goods and services produced. Remember, for that formula, we add consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, and that net exports was exports minus imports. And economic growth, what we're covering in this chapter, that is the growth rate of GDP per capita. So we're going to be looking at the changes in GDP per capita from year to year, and that's what we kind of define economic growth as. And that's definitely going to pop up and be a question that you see here in a little bit, so keep that in mind, that definition of economic growth and what it means. This is table 11.1 from your book, and it just kind of shows us a breakdown of the living conditions in poor nations versus rich nations. Among the poor nations, we have Bangladesh, Haiti, North Korea, Niger, Liberia, Tanzania, Nepal, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe. And then our wealthy nations are going to include Australia, Denmark, Israel, Japan, Germany, South Korea, and the United States. And there's some more on there, but that's just kind of a brief pairing of what we're considering to be a poor nation versus a wealthy nation. Now, the first group of indicators here, these are going to be related to mortality. So that's this kind of top section right here. And that's going to be showing us in the poor countries, 53 out of 1,000 live births are going to die either at birth or in the first year of life. But then if we look over here at the rich number, we only have about 4 out of 1,000 that will die in the first year. Now, it's very important. We have our GDP per capita at the top here. In these poor countries, the average GDP per capita, which is an average income per year, is $1,872 US, whereas in a rich country, it's about $40,651. So that's a pretty big difference. And I think that most of us probably couldn't even imagine living on only $1,872 for the entire year. Now, another indicator here, just going back to talking about the infant mortality rates, that's also telling us that infants are 13 times more likely to die in poor nations, and those that survive 1 year in the poor nations are about 15 times more likely to die before their 5th birthday. So that's the second indicator right here. So these numbers are very high and they're very alarming. And it goes on to kind of tell us our overall life expectancies here. In poor nations, the overall life expectancy is only about 62 years, whereas an average for richer nations is about 81. And again, it's much higher in some places and even lower in others. So just something to kind of keep in mind. This second grouping of indicators right here, this middle section, is kind of explaining the mortality data, like giving us some reasoning for why these figures are true. And this first indicator is physicians per 10,000 people. So you can see here, there's only about 2 physicians for every 10,000 people in poorer nations, whereas there's about 29 physicians for 10,000 people in richer nations. Again, when we go to these statistics a little bit further down, clean water and sanitation are only available to a small fraction of people in poor nations, whereas those are things that we typically hear in other rich nations, that we have very easy access to clean water and things like that. And one of the reasons that infant mortality rates are so high is because of that lack of access to clean water. So that's kind of an interesting fact there. And then this bottom group of indicators is talking about literacy rates. So we want to notice here the literacy rates in poor countries are obviously significantly lower than that of those in richer nations. But we also want to look at the fact that women have less access to both secondary and post-secondary education than men in most poor nations. And equal access would imply kind of that 100% enrollment. And you can see here that we're close to that 100% equality mark there. So just overall, this is kind of giving you an idea of how economic wealth really matters in a country. A richer nation, you have access to these facilities that can provide life-saving care and provide those, utilities that are clean water and things like that allow you to be a little bit healthier. So just something to keep in mind as we work through this chapter. Now, historical growth, we have a little bit of information here about an economic historian that's named Angus Madison. And he started estimating GDP levels for a lot of different nations starting at the year AD 1. So for most of human history, the average person's life was one subsistence living, it was one of subsistence living. And what that means is that they were kind of creating their own materials. They were kind of having to do everything they needed themselves to sustain themselves. There were a lot of global variations noticeable around 1700, but a lot of people, really everyone, was still poor. And then the Industrial Revolution happened. And this rapid technological progress really started to kind of set apart who would become rich nations and who would become poor nations based on who was, experiencing that growth. And I see Eric said, put women over men for the division. Yes, that is correct. Now, moving on a little bit here, this is figure 11.1 from your book. History books are often going to focus on the prominent historical figures like kings and queens and people who are really quite wealthy, especially in comparison to their contemporaries. So in comparison to like other people in life. But the experience of average people was much less glorious than like these historical figures that you learn about. And understanding this really gives us a different perspective on modern wealth and clarifies possible policy alternatives that go forward. So on the graph on this slide, for about 1700 years, the standard of living for the average person really didn't change at all. It was finally during that Industrial Revolution, whenever technology began to grow faster than the population, that per capita GDP began to rise. So if you look at this graph right here, on the x-axis we have our years, on the y-axis we have our real GDP per capita, and then you can see there's really not a lot of changes happening. And then around that Industrial Revolution time in the 1700s, we had exponential growth here. So that exponential growth was directly related or correlated to that Industrial Revolution. Now, here's a practice what you know. When economists use the phrase economic growth, what are they referring to? So Eric, you're really close with C, but we're not just looking at GDP. Oh, you caught it already. Yes, so the correct on this one is going to be A. It's going to be percentage changes in real GDP per capita. So you were very close by saying C. Real GDP growth is an indicator that they do use to look at how the economy is growing, but economic growth specifically is concerned with the per person or per capita measurements. So that's going to be percentage changes in the real GDP per capita. So great job. You caught yourself really quick there, so wonderful. Here's another question. The period in time when the GDP per capita for the world started to increase faster than it had was during what years? Now, this is a little bit tricky. Remember, this was in like 1750. And remember how we name our hundreds, I guess, in this case. Very good. So the Industrial Revolution started to happen in around like the 1750s, 1770s, and so that is called the 1800s. And the correct answer is C. So great job there. You guys are doing wonderful, as usual. Now let me go ahead and pop this whole slide up, and then we'll sort of talk about it a little bit. It's important to kind of note here that while there's still obviously income inequality today, we are all much better off than we were hundreds of years ago. In other words, poor people today are better off than poor people in the 1800s, and today's wealthy people are better off than wealthy people were in the 1800s. So notice the USA was wealthier 200 years ago than Liberia is today. So that's kind of interesting. Liberia's GDP per capita is around like 1800, like we saw in that first figure that we looked at. And you can see that those are today's numbers, and that the United States in the year 1800, the average income was about $2,000 in 2010 dollars. Liberia's 2012 income average was 1,200 in 2010 US dollars. So that's kind of like an interesting thing to say, that wealth is obviously not distributed evenly, considering that people in the 1800s in the US were wealthier than people in Liberia are today. And we'll kind of talk about why that is as we go forward. And this isn't really like a political thing or anything like that. We're just looking at the economic facts of GDP per capita, and then talking about things that influence economic growth and maybe why those happen in some countries and don't happen in others. So this is figure 11.2. Both wealthy and poor nations are better off today compared to 200 years ago. We've already covered that. Many of the current disparities between rich and poor nations began about 200 years ago, but there are some nations that have moved from poor to rich as recently as the past couple of decades. So in 1950, Liberia was richer than Taiwan. But today, Taiwan is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and Liberia is still at kind of around 1,200 per capita income. Now, Americans today are much wealthier than most others in the world, but this isn't just something that happened overnight. The reason that we're wealthier in America than other countries is because the incomes were growing year by year, even just by a little bit. So that's kind of the main takeaway that I want you to get from a lot of this chapter, is that slow and low, steady growth is going to be more sustainable and more productive than short bursts of growth, or obviously no growth at all. Now, the mathematics of growth and how we calculate things, we're going to get into that here in a minute. But the difference between 0 and 1% obviously seems trivial to a lot of people. I mean, if you get, an 85 on your exam and I curved it to an 86, like you probably wouldn't think that was that significant of a change. But in terms of economic growth, this small increase is going to be historically unprecedented. So the mathematics of growth are going to show us that just small changes in that growth rate are going to make a huge difference over time, especially whenever we're compounding that growth. So think about like compounding interest in your bank. And then this is just kind of showing us where like the breakout of poverty for the United States started to happen. So it's showing you our different economic growth rates. So the different growth rates of that GDP per capita per year. And you can see that it's kind of steadily been going up, and it's hovered around 2%. That's kind of like a pretty common number right there. And we'll explain this a little bit more later, but I just wanted you to see kind of what our growth rates look like from the past until up to about 2000. Now, the growth rate of the real GDP per capita, this is going to be the most important growth rate that we consider. The formula on the slide, you definitely want to write down. Remember this percent with the triangle, that's percent change. So we're taking the percent change in nominal GDP minus that percent change in prices minus that percent change in population. And this is just kind of another way to write that, because we love to write things as many different ways as we can in economics. But by far, this is going to be the most important growth rate that we consider. And remember that the term economic growth is something very specific, and that's the annual growth rate of the per capita real GDP. And this is going to be how we measure an average person's income changes over time, with like those price changes kind of figured in. So like we talked about before, your history books are really concerned with like, monarchs and like heads of state and things like that. But this real GDP per capita growth rate, that's going to be like the average person's income. And obviously in economics, that's going to be something that we're very interested in. Now, if you have a pen and paper with you, you can kind of just work through this. The math is already done for you here. They're giving you a lot of this stuff, but I just want to kind of walk you through like where it's coming from. So starting with the nominal GDP data that we have up here for 2013 and 2014, we're looking at table 11.4 in your textbook. We're going to compute the nominal GDP growth as 3.9%. And what they did here was, you remember, you take your new year minus your base year divided by that base year. In this case, 2013 is our base year. And that nominal growth is telling you, or I'm sorry, that's the real growth. I apologize, that was not the right formula. They're really just saying what percentage of 16,700 or 16,768,000 is this new number for 2014. So there was a 3.9% nominal growth, and that's just a regular percentage of what was the percentage difference from 16 to 17. Now, after we've calculated that nominal GDP, part of that increase we know is because of inflation, and then we have our price level that they gave us here. Our price level was 1.5%, or inflation was 1.5%. So we have to subtract that from that nominal GDP to get that real GDP. Now, if you had used that formula that I incorrectly stated at the beginning here, you would have gone directly from here down to this real GDP growth. And that's something that you absolutely can do. They're just showing you it step by step with some of these given percentages. Now, once you have our real GDP growth, we have to take out our population growth. In this case, they told you that population grew by 0.7%. And then that final number is going to be roughly our economic growth or real per capita GDP growth. I would definitely recommend keeping this slide kind of marked. It's slide 14, and it does kind of help you to work through some of those problems on your assignment. So if you have any trouble calculating these, they'll typically give you everything that you need. You really just need to know that nominal growth, you take out inflation, that gives you real GDP. Take out population growth, that's going to give you that real per capita GDP growth. And they will give you all the information that you need for these. Now, growth in income levels, let me go ahead and just pop this whole slide up. We really want to know how long will it take income to double, because income doubling is really significant and it doesn't happen in a single year. Obviously, if you just think about any job that you've ever had, even though you may get little raises every year, it's not very typical that your income just suddenly doubles in a single year. A doubling would imply that it grew by 100%. If annual growth is about 2%, we want to know how long is it going to take us to get to that doubling rate or to grow by 100%. And when we compound our growth, it's going to make it occur faster than 50 years. Because when we see this 2%, we're going to assume, okay, if income's growing at about 2%, our income will be double in 50 years. But that's not right. It actually takes only about 35 years. And that's because of this rule of 70. So the rule of 70 states that if the annual growth rate is X%, the size of that variable doubles every 70 divided by X years. So if the growth rate is 2%, income is going to roughly double in about 35 years. If the growth rate is 3%, income will roughly double in about 23 years. And the way that they do that is just 70 divided by 2 gives you 35. 70 divided by 3 gives you 23. Now, it's really important to remember that when we're looking at this rule of 70, and you'll have to use this formula to do a practice what you know here in a second, that we're not converting that percentage to a decimal. So to get the doubling rate for a 2% annual growth, we got 35. That's just 70 divided by 2. You don't have to move that decimal over 2 places to the left like we do in a lot of other formulas. For the doubling rate for 3%, we use that rule of 70 formula. 70 divided by 3, we get about 23 years. So that's how they're getting those calculations. It's very important to remember to not move that decimal place. You won't get the right answer, and it will become very confusing for you. Now, table 11.5 is just kind of giving you an example of compounded growth, which is basically what that rule of 70 is accounting for. And what that means is that small, consistent growth rates, if we can sustain them for a decade or two, are really going to impact our living standards. So you can see here, we have our income changes over 5 years up to year 35, and that would be the doubling, obviously. Year 1, if we have 50,000 income, year 35, we have 100,000. And then we're just looking at 2% increases in that income our income that we're starting with for the next year is higher. So that means that the percentage growth is going to have a greater effect than it did on the previous year. And that's kind of how compounding works. Think about if you have a bank account that earns interest, you're not just going to earn $10,000 times 2% interest for 100 years. You're going to earn $10,000 plus whatever interest you had previously earned as the years go on. Now, the rule of 70 kind of illustrated for a dollar. We want to know, what can we learn from this rule of 70? Well, we know that we've kind of talked about already. Small and consistent growth rates, if we can sustain them, are going to greatly impact our living standards. And over the long course of history, growth rates were essentially zero until we started to experience that industrial revolution. So the growth rate was zero because even though we had some technological advances, we had a lot of population growth as well. The difference now over the past 2 centuries is that we've had small, consistent growth rates because of changes that have happened during the Industrial Revolution, and that greatly impacts our value of a dollar. So this is kind of showing you a dollar of income at different growth rates. With 0% growth rate, obviously we're never going to double, and a dollar is always worth a dollar. Now, if we have a 1% annual growth rate, it's going to take us 70 years to double. That's 70 divided by 1. And it's going to take us approximately, after 70 years, that dollar is going to be worth about $2. With a 2% growth rate, it will take 35 years to double. 75 divided by 2 gives you 35. And after 70 years, our dollar is going to be worth about $4. With a 3% growth rate, 70 divided by 3 gives us 23.3 years to double. And after 70 years, our dollar is now worth $8. And then with a 4% growth rate, 70 divided by 4 gives you 17.5 years to double. And after 70 years, our dollar is now worth $16. So that's just kind of giving you a small, very basic example of how that rule of 70 works, and to kind of demonstrate how these small changes in percentages, so, just from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 or 3 to 4, that these small changes in growth rates are going to have pretty big impacts. So here's a practice what you know. If the annual growth rate is 7%, how long will it take for income to double? Very good, Eric. You guys are quick today. It will take 10 years. So remember, with the rule of 70, we just take our 70 years divided by 7 because that's the growth rate, and we get 10 years. So good job. See, I promised you the math wouldn't be very difficult this chapter. Now, living standards from 1950 to 2010. This is table 11.7 from your book, and it's kind of showing you the economic growth from 1950 to 2010. We can look at these actual growth rates of various countries over a long period of time to see the impact on income levels. So this table is going to present the growth rates of several countries over 58 years. And this portion of the table that we've kind of highlighted over here on the left is going to show countries that have growth rates that are near 0%, which what that means is that most of these countries, all of these countries, are really no better now than they were in 1950. So we have the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, and North Korea. And you can see that their growth rates are either negative in some cases or very, very close to zero. Now, if you look at their real GDP per capita in 1950 compared to their real GDP per capita in 2010, they're either doing worse than they were in 1950, or they're only doing just slightly better in the smallest sense. And you can see here that not having that economic growth, even a small percentage, has a really big impact on how the income progresses. Now let's go ahead and go to a little bit further down on that table. This is showing you, oh, I think I've gone a little too far. Okay, this is showing you countries that have about 1% of growth. And you can see here, here's their real GDP per capita in 1950, and here's theirs in 2010. If they have about 1% growth, they are seeing improvements since 1950. So just going from our close to 0 to 1%, you can see it does have a pretty big impact. Now, if we look at countries that had growth of about 2%, like the US, Mexico, Australia, the UK, and Chile, you can see that that 2% makes a really significant difference in 50 years. So that's just something to kind of, or 58 years. Something to consider is that just a very, very small percentage ends up with very, very big changes. And growth near 2% means that our living standards have really almost quadrupled in 58 years. So that's something to think about here. Now, just because 2% is our average doesn't mean that 2% is the highest average. These are some countries that have growth rates that are greater than 2%. And you can see that their changes from 1950 to 2010 are even greater. So growth of 3% or more over 58 years, this is enough to move some nations from being among the world's poorest to being among the world's richest. And this occurred with the explosive growth in Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, and China. These are all countries that are growing very, above the average, and it is kind of catching them up. So even if countries didn't hit that initial industrial revolution jump that we and some of the other rich nations experienced, there is still hope that they can grow and catch up. Now, just kind of like a really brief example, just to kind of talk about Shanghai. So over the past 20 years, China has grown at about 9%. So that's pretty massive as far as growth rates go. And it's honestly considered staggering. And even if it slows to half that rate, so 4.5%, it will still certainly vault China into the group of the wealthiest nations in the coming decades. So just 25 years ago, on the other hand, China was very, very poor. In your book, there's figure 24.3, if you want to take a look at that, that shows two pictures. So Shanghai is kind of considered the New York City of China. And in these two pictures, the bottom picture is from 2010 and the top picture is from 1990. And you can see in this picture, this is the 2010 picture that's on this slide, that they've had some massive growth. So it just goes to show that just because you aren't amongst the richest nations, that doesn't mean that you can't experience growth that will significantly improve the standard of living. Now, table 11.8, this is showing you the US 1960 compared to 2010. It's showing you things like the life expectancies, physicians per 10,000 people, how much school people have completed, the portion of income we spend on food, our work week averages, workforce in agriculture and manufacturing, and home ownership. And you can see that our life expectancies have improved, our number of physicians per 10,000 people have improved, we are more educated, we are spending less of our income on food, our work weeks have gotten a little shorter, even if it doesn't feel that way sometimes. Less people are working in agriculture or manufacturing, and more people are homeowners. So that's kind of just a good way for economists to look at and determine if there's been an improvement in the standard of living or a decline. And obviously from this data, we can kind of infer that we've had an improvement. Now, just to give you some more comparisons, comparing the 1960 versus 2010 in the US, the average size of a new home that people would buy in the US in 1960 was only about 1,200 square feet, whereas now in 2010, so not exactly now, a little dated, that was about 2,400 square feet. Bedrooms were 2, now it's 3, bathrooms 1, now 2.5, and central air conditioning is something. So again, there's a million different ways we can look at, a million different things we can look at to kind of take a guess at those standard of living improvements. Cars, what's changed in that? That's another measure that you can look at to see. And again, people are spending a little more on their cars, they're getting better gas mileage, they have more horsepower, and a lot of things that were optional or non-existent are standard in cars in 2010 versus 1960. And then they give you kind of TVs as an example. We're buying bigger TVs, they're high def, and they're cheaper. So again, remember when we talked about how typically most prices will gradually increase, but some things that's not the case? This is a good example of something that's not the case. Although this TV on the right, the 2010 TV, is clearly better than the TV from 1960, it's actually cheaper. Do y'all remember why that TV on the right might be cheaper than what a TV was in 1960? So I'll give you a second to think about that and give me a comment here, and then we'll move on a little bit. So why would TVs be cheaper in 2010 than they were in 1960? Yeah, Jessica says technology, and that's exactly right. Technology has improved, so some things are able to be manufactured more cheaply. Therefore, we get to kind of experience some of those savings as well. Okay, so this video we're not going to watch, but it talks about the lifespan and wealth for 200 countries over 200 years. I highly recommend that you guys go out and search on YouTube Hans Rosling's 200 Countries, 200 Years in 4 Minutes. I'm going to go ahead and type that in the comment box here so that you guys will have it for later. But this is definitely, it's a short video. He's like a really charming older gentleman that is very interesting to watch. And it's definitely worth a watch. So let me go ahead and type that into the comment box here. And you guys go and look that up after class today for me, please, and watch that video. It's definitely worth a watch. She's very good. And if you ever want more kind of like economic information, outside of what we do in class, and you're just, curious in the middle of the night watching videos, Hans Rosling has some very interesting economics videos. So I know some of you are like, there's no such thing as an interesting economics video, but watch the Hans video and then let me know what y'all think on Thursday about that. So the causes of economic growth, there's 3 main causes. They're resources, technology, and institutions. We've seen that economic growth is important. We know that. But now we're going to kind of look at why all 3 of these things are necessary for growth and then kind of talk about how those impact growth. So resources is number 1 on the list. And let me go ahead and pop this whole slide up for you. But just to give you an example, resources are going to be the inputs that we use to produce goods and services. So land is going to be physical land and the natural resources on that land. Some examples they give you are coal in the US, oil in Saudi Arabia, and lumber in Canada. And we know your geography, where you're located, is going to affect your weather, disease, and trade possibilities. So just kind of an example, Saudi Arabia produces about 10 million barrels of oil a day. And this is 12% of the world output of 15 gallons of oil per Saudi every day. So at $100 per barrel, which is obviously not the case now, this means that oil alone would generate $365 billion in Saudi GDP per year. Oil is a natural resource, and clearly this is contributing to their economic prosperity. Now, in the US, we have fertile farmland, we have forests, we have coal, we have iron ore, and we even have oil. We supply about 12% of the world's oil in the US, but that's not really where, all of our GDP comes from. So other kind of like land items, obviously coal, iron ore, diamonds, lumber, natural gas, this is kind of thought of as a variation of land, but it's important to remember land isn't enough for growth to happen. So Liberia, for example, has diamonds and forests. If Liberia has diamonds and forests, why is Liberia's real GDP per capita only about 1,200? So think about that, and we'll kind of talk about it a little bit more here in a second. Now, this is just showing you global GDP density. So locations on coasts or along rivers like the Amazon in South America developed really early on, and they've really continued to develop more rapidly than areas that are inland. The picture on this slide is going to kind of indicate to you the importance of both geography and international trade. So land resources alone are not going to make a nation wealthy. Many poor nations are very rich in natural resources. We know, Liberia has mahogany forests, iron ore deposits, rubber tree forests, diamonds, and a beautiful coastline. But even with all of these resources, Liberia is poor. So even having all these natural resources, what are some things that you guys think, just without really knowing, there's not any wrong answers here, could make Liberia not able to experience economic growth despite the fact that they have resources? What could be a barrier? Thinking about, those 3 main things that we talked about that are important to economic growth: resources, technology, and institutions. What is keeping Liberia from having sustainable growth? So I'll give you guys a second to think about that and type some answers, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So value of goods definitely could be something. Maybe they're not, able to sell goods for as much. Mario says corruption. That is related to institutions, and that is a big part of it. We'll talk about, more of why that's a big part of it here in a little bit, but that's a very good answer as well. But yeah, overall, there can be a lot of different reasons that they're not experiencing that growth, and we'll cover those reasons in the next couple of slides. Now, another part of resources is labor, and not only labor, but effective labor. So labor is going to be your workers in the economy, and effective labor is labor that's adjusted for training and education. And training can be anything from literacy to very specific job training. And the more educated your workforce is, generally the more productive they are. So kind of recall that more women entering the workforce greatly increase the US GDP. So many women worked at home only in the mid-1950s, and this work was typically not counted in the GDP. So think house care, child care, meal prep, those kind of things. Effective labor is going to adjust for training and education and is going to be a better measure for labor resource in a country. We already talked about how training can include everything from basic literacy to college education to software competencies. But the labor resource can increase either by increasing our number of workers or by educating our existing labor force or by doing both of those. So not many people would really doubt that a more educated labor force is more productive, but India struggled for many years, even with one of the most educated workforces. So that's another thing to consider, like our Liberia example. We said, okay, Liberia has great natural resources, but they're still not very prosperous. India had a very educated labor force, but they still weren't prosperous. So what's going on here? And we'll kind of talk about how that ties in a lot more in the next couple slides, but you guys are already on the right track with the things like corruption and lack of proper institutions. So brain drain, just to give you a little bit extra here, I'm going to go ahead and pop this up. This is economically defined as when skilled professionals immigrate out of a country. And what that means is they leave that country. And it happens because people might want to move to a country that has more opportunities or higher pay. And regulations or laws might force people to work away or to move away to work. Now, a result of brain drain is that a country can lose a lot of its productive workers and they can suffer some slowed growth as a result. There's a good article on this slide that you can click the link in the PDF to read about America's brain drain, but we're definitely not going to go over that in this particular lecture. But India experiences a lot of brain drain as well as a lot of other smaller countries because the more educated somebody becomes, they realize that it might be more beneficial to them to immigrate out of the country and go and work somewhere else. Now, capital is another resource. We know that capital is just kind of the main items that we have. So the purpose of capital is to aid in the construction of future output. In this sense, it's like land and labor. We consider it a resource, and we consider it to be more tools that are making it possible to produce more output. Obviously, your workers are going to be more productive if they have better roads, factories, and tools to work with. In poor nations, paved roads are non-existent, or if they have them, they're in disrepair. Their vehicles are lower quality, computers are considered a luxury. Even public electricity and sewage treatment facilities are really rare in a lot of developing nations. And not having this capital, again, hinders their ability to experience economic growth. Now, let me go ahead and pop up this whole slide so we can talk about it here. Whenever we first started to kind of look in economics at growth theory and figuring out what makes nations grow and what makes nations successful, the main focus here was physical capital. So we really thought that if we just kind of built roads, we built factories, we started to give people these capital resources, that countries would grow. However, factories, dams, and other capital projects just fell into disrepair. What that means is that they were just completely kind of abandoned and not taken care of. They really didn't mesh well in the economies that we tried to build them in. And we started to realize there must be something else going on here. So in the elusive quest for growth, economist William Easterly said that the World Bank helped finance Morogoro shoe factory in Tanzania in the 1970s. The shoe factory had labor, machines, and the latest shoemaking technology. It had everything except shoes. So think about that. He said it never produced more than 4% of its installed capacity. The factory, which had planned to supply the entire Tanzanian shoe market and then export 3/4 of its planned production of about 4 million shoes to Europe, never exported a single shoe, and then production ceased in 1990. So this lesson is that capital by itself is not enough. So why, even if they were given this big factory, all the machines that they use, all the workers, how could they possibly have not been successful? And that's because there are other things at play in economic growth outside of just resources, and those things are technology and also institutions, and we'll get into those a little bit more here in a minute. So technology, this is a big part of economic growth. Technological advances in farming mean that over time we get more corn per acre of land, right? That's kind of like a basic example. So in the United States, our corn yield per acre is about 6 times what it was in 1930. In 1930, we only produced about 25 bushels of corn per acre, but now our yield is over 150 bushels per acre. And the reason this is possible is because of new technology. So hybrid seeds, herbicides, fertilizers, all these things have made us more productive. Technology is just the knowledge available for use in production. A technological advance means that we have new knowledge or new production techniques. We can produce more for less, like with the corn example. An example that you'll see a lot of times is Henry Ford and how he came up with the first kind of assembly line to build cars. And then we've already talked about those agricultural advances. So paired with the right labor and resources, whenever you have technology, this can be a great game changer for growth. Now, this is figure 11.4 from your book, and it's showing kind of another example of agricultural changes from technological advancement. And what it's saying is, if you read the little blurb about it in your book, that we have significantly fewer milk cows in the US than at any time since 1920. But our total milk output is at a historical high because we're now able to get about 4 times as much milk from each cow. And the reason that we're able to do this is because of technological advancements that allow us to produce more while using fewer resources. So again, this on the left, we're seeing less cows. On the right, we're seeing more milk production. And that's possible because of technology. Now, some more on technology here. Economic growth occurs when resources and technology are able to work together. So innovations do not occur randomly across the whole globe. We used to think this. We used to think that capital was really all that mattered, and that innovation was just kind of like lightning. It was random, who knew when it would strike, and it had nothing to do with anything else. But now we're starting to know that innovation isn't random. So some places produce large clusters of innovations. Think like MIT, Silicon Valley, movie and television ideas in Hollywood, new fashion from Paris and Milan. So technological innovations typically will breed more innovations. So this allows us to kind of reword an earlier question. Why do some regions innovate and grow more than others? So perhaps that answer is technology, but another part of that answer is institutions. So institutions are kind of one of the most important parts of this economic growth kind of, chasm here. If we don't have strong institutions, we will not have growth. And when they say institutions, they mean things like government structure, laws, protections, things like that. These are all institutions. So in 1950, Liberia was wealthier than Taiwan, to give you an example. And today, the GDP per capita in Taiwan is more than 20 times greater than Liberia. And why, we ask here? Well, political stability in Taiwan, along with really well-defined property rights protection. Coercion, corruption, and instability happens in Liberia, so there's not really a dependable sense of ownership there. Before 2006, it had been about 35 years since a Liberian president assumed office by peaceful means without bloodshed. So both of the previous two national leaders, Charles Taylor and Samuel Doe, consistently used coercive power of government to eradicate opposition. What that means is, if somebody was running against them or somebody was trying to take them out of power, they just killed them. Now, on the other hand, Taiwan's political climate has been relatively stable since 1949. And what that means is that there's been really stable institutions, really stable laws and property rights. Think about it this way. if you lived somewhere, like, okay, let's say you live in the United States, like you do, and you're thinking about opening a business. You know that if you open that business and that you buy a building and you buy machinery and that you start producing, that no one can just come and take that machinery away from you. No one can just come and take your money away. The government protects you. You have private property rights. There are laws in place, things like that. Now imagine if there weren't private property rights and there weren't those protections by the law, and you lived somewhere where you're trying to open a business, but you knew that frequently gangs would come and take away businesses from people or take the money away. You're going to be a lot less motivated to open your business if you don't have those protections of kind of those basic laws, basic rules, private property, things like that. And that's exactly why Liberia has not been able to grow like other countries have. It's because they don't have stable institutions. So, regardless of what great resources they have or what great technology is now available in the world, they just don't have the institutions in place to support that growth. And then they were asking on this slide back here, would you rather invest in a business that opened in Liberia or a business that opened in Taiwan? And I think that just from hearing that, I can probably guess, but what do y'all think? Would you rather invest in a business in Liberia or Taiwan? I'll let you type it up there just for laughs here. Mario says Taiwan. I would have to agree with you. Jessica also says Taiwan, just because with those institutions in place, you are a lot more likely to, reap the benefits of your investment. Now, some more on institutions. Let me go ahead and pop all this up. Institutions are not always going to be tangible physical items that we can really look at and hold. There might be a physical representative of an institution, such as the U.S. Constitution, the Federal Reserve Board, but really the essence of the institution is going to be comprised of our expectations and our habitual practices, not anything physical. The rules and the mindset within the Federal Reserve Board are what's going to be important, not the building or the chairs. So just because we have a building that says, this is where the Federal Reserve Board lives, we don't really care about that. What we care about is the consistent kind of implementation that laws are enforced, regulations are upheld, the government steps in if they need to. And this kind of creates a conditioning where we know what to expect. This can include work habits, expectations, political behavior, any of those things. It's not just that you kind of build a building, in Liberia and say, okay, now they have stable government. There has to be the practice of that stable government acting over a period of time that makes people realize, okay, this really is a real thing, before the institution could be effective. Now, some important institutions for economic growth. I'm going to go ahead and pop these all up. Political stability and the rule of law, private property rights, stable money and prices, competitive markets, efficient taxes, international trade, and the flow of funds across borders. So we'll discuss some of those in more detail, but this is it's obviously not a comprehensive list, but it is a good list to keep with you whenever you're working on your homework and things like that. Now, political stability and the rule of law, going back to Liberia here, let me pop all this up so you can kind of look at it while I talk about it. From 1980 to 2003, Liberia received about $4 billion in international aid, so about $75 per person per year, or 10% of what the average person income during that period was. So $75 doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think of it as 10% of the average person's income, it was a lot. Some more details here. In 1980, there was a rebel leader that was named Samuel Doe. He charged into the office of the sitting president, who was William Tolbert, and basically brutally killed him right on the spot. Then Samuel Doe became the leader of Liberia, even winning a staged election in 1986. Doe led Liberia until he was also captured, tortured, and killed by another group of rebels in 1990. So after this coup, Charles Taylor was installed as the leader, himself, becoming president again through staged elections in 1995. And his regime in Liberia was one of really constant battles. So even in the capital city in Monrovia, by the summer of 2003, 5 rebel groups had converged on the capital from different directions. So not people that were working together, just 5 different sets of people that didn't like what was going on. And this river served as a dividing line between the rebel groups and the territory that was held by Taylor's militia. Everything that stood in the way on both sides got riddled with bullets. So just all that to say, if you live somewhere where there's constantly this turmoil, one leader getting murdered, then another rebel like violently taking over, and then there's always this constant fighting, there's never going to be any time for stable policies to be put into place or for success to happen. Just because they were receiving that aid doesn't mean that the aid was being used where they actually needed it. A lot of the aid was seized by force. So anytime that they did try to kind of send out aid to the people, a new rebel would kill the leader, this person would take over, they'd go and take the aid back. Blanket aid by itself really doesn't provide incentives. If you're just given money and not told what to spend it on, or not given kind of exact directions, you're not likely to go and invest that money in education or a new capital for a business, things like that. It's going to just kind of perpetuate that instability. And then again, no growth can happen. Now, this is figure 11.5 from your book, and this is showing us kind of the rule of law and income. The World Justice Project has collected a lot of data on the rule of law across the world. The rule of law index is going to be positively correlated with levels of income. Now, what that means is that the better the enforcement of the rule of law, the better that your incomes are going to be, the higher your average per capita GDP is going to be. So you can see here, if my little bar will go down, our x-axis is showing us kind of, okay, well, that's not going to go away. Sorry about that. Let me go back here. Our x-axis is showing us sort of like our enforcement of law. So obviously closer over here is going to be the better enforcement, and the incomes are higher. The least appropriately your laws are enforced, the lower the incomes tend to be. And that's kind of the main takeaway here. Private property rights are very, very important. Now, private property rights are perhaps really the most important institution for fostering growth. This institution creates the incentive here for you to be innovative and expand production. Like I said before, if you thought that somebody's just going to come take everything that you build away, you're not going to be very motivated to build. Individuals can own property, they can own resources, and the resulting output that you create with those resources. This is our biggest incentive for voluntary production. You can own a share of things that you produce, and that gives you an incentive to produce more. So this example at the bottom here, Shaogang, China in 1978, farmers split a commune into family-owned plots and agreed to keep surplus agricultural output beyond the government quota. Now, this is important, and we'll talk a little bit more about this on the coming slides. But basically, in 1978, there were government quotas that were required among different communes for farmers to produce. They weren't producing for their own benefit, they were only producing for the government. Now, in Shaogang, China, these farmers split up their government-appointed land, and they started making them family-owned plots. They didn't have like the institution or the government protection for this, but they said, anything that we produce over what that government quota is, we'll keep for our own family. So that was kind of them giving their own incentive. This is a picture of that agreement, but the literal translation here was December 1978, Mr. Yan's home, and they said, we divide the field to every household. Every leader of the household should sign and stamp. If we are able to produce, every household should promise to finish any amount they are required to turn in, no longer asking the government for food or money. If this fails, even if we go to jail or have our heads shaved, we will not regret. Everyone else, the common people who are not officers and signees of this agreement, also promise to raise our children until they are 18 years old. So that's kind of interesting, this agreement. Let's kind of go to like some information about it on this slide. But the agreement here was they were going to keep all output above the government quota. They would not take any more food or money from the government. And this was kind of an agricultural boom, not boon, there's a typo there. There was a lot more output than there had been in previous years, and the Chinese leaders instituted agricultural reforms as a result of this agreement, and then manufacturing reforms later. So the lesson here, China grew not because of new resources or technology, but because these people kind of figured out how to make private property rights. Now, in 1978, this agreement was really dangerous, and it was so dangerous that that last part of the agreement, if you heard, kind of stipulated that they would raise another's children if the signees were put in jail. So it was dangerous because it was just the institution. The people didn't really own the property. The government owned that property, and the people had no incentive to work hard and produce. Now that keeping that property that belonged to the government, it could have gotten them in a lot of trouble, but luckily for them, the government saw how much more productive they were, and then private property rights began to be instituted. Now, stable money and prices, this is another institution that's important. Uncertainty about future prices makes people not really want to invest and decreases the production and the productivity of people. In the US, the Fed kind of makes sure that this all stays square, and they administer monetary policy. So largely, the Fed is supposed to be politically independent, but the governor terms at the Fed are going to be staggered. No president can appoint more than 2 governors, things like that. The Fed is the Federal Reserve, and they kind of shape that monetary policy. And that's an important institution in the US that helps maintain our economic growth and things like that. Now, competitive markets. Remember, we talked about competitive markets earlier in the semester, but some characteristics, just in case you forgot. It's very easy for firms to enter and exit. Buyers can expect to find low prices and a wide availability of goods. There are benefits to society like creative destruction. So new things are invented, outdated methods are sent out, and economic growth happens. And only the fittest firms survive. So firms are kind of forced to be efficient. It can hurt some people, competitive markets, obviously the people that go out of business or lose money, but it benefits society as a whole. So the societal benefits of the competitive market are greater than the cost of people losing. Some examples, car replacing the buggy, DVD and Blu-ray replacing the VCR, digital cameras replacing older ones. Innovation is basically encouraged by these competitive markets because the lower cost methods give firms higher profits, and then they have a better chance to kind of survive and prosper. And this in itself is an incentive for growth and innovation. So that's a very important institution. Now, efficient taxes, also a really important institution of economic growth. Taxes are a trade-off, right? They have to be high enough to kind of support effective government, but they also have to be low enough that people support paying the tax. So the challenge here is finding that level that supports the government but doesn't cripple economic growth. And we use that money to provide government services, so like law enforcement and infrastructure, things like that. If we tax activities that are kind of fundamental to growth, economics theory kind of predicts that we'll see less of these activities. So think about this in particular. When income-producing activities are taxed, so like income taxes, it reduces the incentives to earn income to go out and work. Output and income are inexplicably going to be linked in a market. So if we tax income, we're taxing output, and then that's going to kind of decrease our GDP. Now, there is an effective way to do this that doesn't cause people to just stop working, but finding that efficient level is very challenging even for the US and even more challenging for these underdeveloped countries. Now, international trade, also very important to economic growth. This is considered an institution as well. This creates kind of specialization, like we talked about how it's more efficient to not just produce everything yourself. It's better to kind of trade with other people. And creating this value allows our output to increase whenever they produce goods that they have the comparative advantage. So without trade, a lot of countries can't really produce every resource necessary for production. And an example of that is the tragic story of Easter Island. This island population grew to 15,000 when they were able to trade for chickens and vegetables with other islands. But once all the trees were cut down and oceanic travel became impossible, the end was just a matter of time. So they basically, their population boomed. They thought they had it really well, but then they overused their own resources rather than trading, and they ended up, becoming abandoned. Now, the flow of funds across borders, this is a really important institution as well. Investment, obviously, if you're going to invest, you have to have savings. The more savings that you have, the more opportunities for investment that you have. If foreigners are able to funnel their savings into your economy, your firms can use these funds to expand. We talked about international investment being a big part of the US, and that is very true. If you have restrictions on the flow of capital across borders, it's really going to hurt domestic firms because they're only going to have access to those domestic savers rather than that much larger international group. Now we're going to skip this one. I promise we're almost done. I still have 10 minutes. So, and we have a couple of practice what you know is coming up. We're not going to watch this clip. I'm hoping that most of you have either read, seen, or at least heard of the Hunger Games. But basically, the Hunger Games is kind of an interesting example of economics in the media. So really kind of the main takeaway economically from the Hunger Games is that economic freedom and the quality of life are really tied hand in hand. So in this video, if you haven't seen the Hunger Games or anything like that and you want to watch it, there's a direct kind of relationship between economic freedom and quality of life. And that's kind of demonstrated by like policies that institutions put into place. In the Hunger Games, for example, the people that live in the capital, they have this very opulent and wealthy life. They're able to do what they want. They have a great quality of life, and they're more kind of innovative and things like that. Now, people in the districts that are simply told what they must produce and what they must do, their quality of life is much lower. And as they start to kind of take back some of that freedom, they have a better quality of life. So just kind of an interesting way to tie in economics with the media. Now here's a practice what you know. Land, labor, and capital are considered what? Very good. They are considered resources. And these are the inputs that we use to produce our goods and services. And here's another one. Why is technological advancement important for economic growth? And very good. I see Eric already said C. It allows us to produce more output while using fewer resources. So this chapter really makes the argument that economic growth is very important to average people. We see kind of a historical perspective on growth, and we've seen that only recently have we really started to improve our standards of living, recently being the last 200 years. Economic growth is really central to modern macroeconomics, and it's going to help us understand how our living standards might be improved around the world. Obviously, there's a lot of history in this chapter. It's a lot of history and economics tied together, but it's a lot of really important concepts. Please do go back and watch that Hans Rosling video that I had put the title of in the comments. It is very short, I promise, and very interesting, so you definitely want to do that. I will go ahead and post the link to this lecture as soon as we finish class today. I will have your participation grades and your exam grades updated and curved by this evening. I'll have your next exam review posted this evening. But other than that, if you don't have any questions, you're free to go ahead and sign off. If you do have any questions, I'll hang around for a second to see if any of those pop up, but I hope you guys are doing well. And thank you for doing those midpoint check-ins. I really appreciate that. And if there's no questions, I'll see you guys on Thursday. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.